HBL Hair Care, healthy ingredients for healthy hair. Enhance health, reveal natural beauty, and give new life to your hair. Experience the holistic difference of HBL Hair Care.
Hi, welcome to this edition of North County Voice. We have with us today David Victor, who is a professor at UCSD, but his reason for being with us today is because he is the chairman of a panel that, believe me, you will want to know more about. David, thanks for joining us today on North County Voice.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
So a community engagement panel was formed about 2 years ago with you as the chair. Tell us why it was formed.
Well, it was set up to create a conduit between Edison, which manages the plant and manages the decommissioning of San Onofre, and the communities, to help Edison understand better what the communities are concerned about, what they care about, and also help the communities understand what would be happening in the process of decommissioning. The decommissioning is relatively rare here in the United States. This is only the fourth or fifth plant to be decommissioned, and people want to know, when are the domes going to come down, what's going to happen with the spent fuel, what are the environmental impacts, job impacts, economic impacts, and this panel has helped to organize that information and make it digestible.
Is there precedent for this type of panel in other decommissionings?
Yeah, so in Maine, I think the closest model that we followed in setting this up was the Maine process, where the utility, when they decommissioned Maine Yankee, set up a similar kind of panel, met on a regular basis, had broad representation from the communities. There's a panel that's been set up under Vermont law to help oversee the process of decommissioning in Vermont. I would say there's a little more testy relationship between Vermont and the local communities there, who have been very concerned about nuclear power for a long time, and the relationship with the utility is not so great. So I think this is now, many people in the industry are looking at this panel now as one of, if not the main model for how to set up this two-way conduit between the communities and the operator of a decommissioning plant.
Tell us how the membership of the panel was established. What were the goals?
So this was set up by Edison itself. There's not a legal obligation under American law to set this up, but they set this up because they wanted to understand what was going on in the communities and what people cared about, and they were concerned that they had not a great relationship with the communities in terms of communicating information, and they wanted to do this properly during the decommissioning process. So they set it up and they own this. Everybody on the panel, there are 18 of us, we're all volunteers, and they ultimately hold the decisions as to who were the members of the panel. But in the bylaws, it's very clear that it needs to be broadly representative of the community, and that's what we have. We have organized labor represented, we have several people from different parts of the environmental community, we have lots of local elected officials, members of town councils, city councils, mayors, we have people from business on the community engagement panel. So it's a pretty broadly representative group.
Do you have a fixed end date on this?
I don't think we do. The panel members themselves will rotate off every 2 to 4 years, and there's kind of a process now being set up to do that. I've just agreed to serve another 2 years as chairman. But decommissioning is a long process and an expensive process, and I think will be in existence for the foreseeable future.
I've heard some people characterize this as a process that's probably going to be somewhat more difficult than building it.
I think so, partly because you're working in the engineers who need to decommission the plant are working in a highly radioactive environment in some areas, and so some of the work is going to be done by robots. There's a lot of really interesting technology that's emerging to deal with irradiated areas and to take the different materials and put them in canisters and then ship them off site ultimately. It's almost as expensive to decommission a nuclear plant as it is to build one. A huge number of jobs, a big economic impact at stake. And I think because there have been so few plants, commercial plants in this country that have been decommissioned, people are learning a lot as the process unfolds, including how to set up the right contracts, what the right technologies are, and so on.
We're going to get into each of the major issues, but could you characterize the overall job in terms of a percentage of it that's unique to a nuclear plant, and let me flesh that out a little bit. The contract issues, the labor issues, that would be true no matter what was happening, whether we're building something or taking it down. But obviously, the fact that there's fissionable material there, I mean, that makes it unique. How much of the job is that?
A huge part of the expense is that, and a lot of the really mission critical job is around dealing with fissile materials, either materials that are in the plant that have been irradiated over time and then need to be handled properly as they're removed, or I think the number one issue we've been spending a lot of time on is what to do with the spent fuel, because there are now eventually going to be 150 or so canisters filled with the spent fuel that over the entire lifetime of the plant were at one point or another inside the reactor core, and then they taken out of the reactor core, put into pools and cooled down, and then now being put into these canisters. And absent someplace to send that, that's going to be on site for the foreseeable future. That's building the facility to house that spent fuel, paying attention to that. That's a long-term job and an incredibly expensive, several $100 million contract.
Every bit of fuel ever used there is still there. Correct?
Every bit of fuel except for a few rods were sent away to some other facilities. I think a few were sent to Illinois, and there have been some experimental trades, as it were. But essentially, everything that was ever in the reactor core is on site, and that's actually true for every other reactor in the country. There are about 60 or so nuclear reactor sites in the United States, and at every single site, essentially all the fuel that's ever been in the core is now still sitting on site.
Let's address some of the issues. There are other environmental issues with this site, both as an operating site and as a site about to be decommissioned, that are not directly connected to the nuclear aspect of it. Let's talk about some of those.
Sure. So our panel spent quite a lot of time looking at the environmental issues, and I've learned a tremendous amount through this process, I can say, and this is one of the areas where I think I've learned the most about environmental law and about the process here. So under federal law and under California law, any major construction project, or deconstruction project is, in this case, has to go through environmental review, environmental quality review. There's a federal process and there's a state process that's just begun right now under under California law. I would say most of the environmental review related to decommissioning is relatively straightforward, because this is an industrial site that has already been disturbed heavily. There are concrete pads and roads and rail spurs and all kinds of stuff like that. And so the process of removing things from it largely doesn't have much net environmental impact. There'll be some impacts about dust. There's a lot of attention to endangered species, things like that. But that's relatively straightforward. The thing that I've learned the most about relates to these ocean conduits. So for each of the reactors, there are pipes up to about 2 miles long, giant pipes that go out into the ocean to draw cool ocean water in, used for cooling on the plant, and then to send the slightly warmer water back out into the ocean. The throughput on those pipes now is essentially zero because the plant is decommissioned, and the cooling needs on the plant are almost zero, not quite zero, but almost zero. And so what do you do with the conduits? Unit 1 there was decommissioned quite a while ago, and the decision was made to leave the conduits in place because the environmental consequences of digging up the giant pipe in the ocean would be worse than just leaving it in place and letting natural reefs form and things like that. I think what I've heard from the environmental community is that most people who've looked closely at this have the same view about the conduits for units 2 and 3, that it'd be better to leave them in place. That also happens to be less expensive, and so that's money that'll eventually be returned back to ratepayers. But I think there's an open question as to whether the California Environmental Quality Review will come to a different conclusion and want to go back to something closer to the original natural state and actually remove those conduits. And I think for environmentalists who are looking at the environmental footprint of the plant and the decommissioning process, that's the most interesting thing to watch right now.
Were important lessons learned from the decommissioning of the first reactor?
Yeah, I think, in my view, that's the most important lesson. It has to do with leaving the conduits in place. The first reactor, the first unit, there are 3 units at San Onofre. So units 2 and 3 are the ones that are being decommissioned right now. Unit 1 already decommissioned. It was a much smaller unit, and so the task of decommissioning it was much smaller, not least because all the other 2 units were still operational, so there was still a nuclear plant. The decommissioning process that we're envisioning right now is going to remove almost every aspect of the construction that has been there. So the domes will come down over the next decade or so. All the materials will be removed. Already Edison seems to be pretty far along in the process of removing fluids and other kinds of working materials on the site. And then, so everything's going to be gone except for the spent fuel. It'll be back to a used industrial site, and then it'll be given back to the Navy. And so I assume will become part of Camp Pendleton.
Is it too early to say where this spent fuel would be in terms at least of east or west of the 5?
It'll be west. It'll be west. The existing pad, what's called an ISFAC, because every simple idea needs a complicated name in this business, as far as I can tell. The existing pad, on which there are 50 or so canisters already with one particular design, that pad is already west of the 5, and the contracts have already been let out for the construction of an expanded pad that's in the same area, using a different design for the canisters and for what's called the overpack, the concrete that houses them and ultimately protects the canisters. All of that's going to happen west of the 5 in the existing site. And I think that probably makes sense, because if you split the site between west of the 5 and east of the 5, then you'd have to monitor 2 sites. And I think we have to remember that at the end of the day, this is not our community's land, as it were. This is the Navy's land. And the Navy is, insofar as they've revealed their hand in this process at all, the Navy says it wants its land back. And so they want to minimize the footprint. And I think actually most of the site east of the 5 is far along in the process of being given back to the Navy.
The issue of the Navy wanting its land back in some ways brings a lot of simplicity to it, because if it were open to public use, we're talking about billions of dollars. I mean, how much land is available that touches the Pacific on the West Coast? Yeah. Virtually none. Is that a done deal? Will the Navy get its way, or are there investor groups or other interest groups that would like their hands on that land that might have a shot at it?
I have heard nothing credible that suggests that there's any scenario other than the land going back to the Navy. And what's going to happen over time is the footprint of the facility is going to shrink. It's already shrunk quite a lot as the land east of the 5 is given back to the Navy. The land west of the 5, as the domes come down, as the spent fuel pools are removed and so on, that will shrink further, and then there'll be this one area left, which is the spent fuel pad, the ISFAC. I have never heard, there have been a lot of proposals for things you could do with land like that, and they're interesting proposals. It's next to a state park, so you could expand the state park as well. There's incredible surfing spots out in front. It's a beautiful area of the world. But I've heard nothing to suggest that there's any scenario other than the Navy getting its land back. And I have to say that the process by which the Navy makes those decisions and the process by which the Navy requests the exact state of the land, that still remains murky to me. As a citizen involved in this process, now reasonably well informed about this, that whole process has been a little hard to understand. And I guess that's reasonable at this stage, but certainly one of the things that I put on our agenda for future meetings when the time is right is for the community engagement panel to invite the Navy and for us to have a conversation so the communities can understand what the Navy is going to be doing, and maybe we can help the Navy understand what the communities care about.
With the exception of the spent fuel issue, which we're going to get to after a short break that's coming up, is there any other issue that's still cloudy, that's significant, or is there a pretty clear plan between now and the end date of this? Well,
I think the plan is pretty clear. So every single meeting of the community engagement panel, the next one's on June 22nd in Southern Orange County. Every meeting begins with an update from Edison on the plan and the timeline, and it's down to the quarter, and it's on track, and it's a well-oiled machine as far as I can tell. So I think there's no ambiguity there. To me, the other big issue that we've spent time talking about in the community engagement panel, and clearly the public's concerned about, is the economic impact. We've looked at evidence to suggest that the comparison between the plant being open and the plant being shut is already a factor of 10 reduction in the overall economic benefits from the plant. And now we're about to have some very big contracts and activities to decommission the plant. It's almost as expensive to take one down and as complex an engineering project to take a plant down as it is to build one. There are going to be a lot of jobs there. Organized labor is very focused on this, and I've received a lot of letters, and they're present and active in the meetings. People are certainly very attentive to how those contracts are let out, and I think that's very important because some communities have been hit really, really hard. Oceanside in particular has been hit really hard by the closure of the plant. A lot of people who worked at the plant were living in Oceanside and have lost their jobs.
It sounds like we need to expand on that beyond what time we have in this first segment. So when we come back, we'll talk more about the economic issue and then move on to the spent fuel issue.
That'd be terrific.
We will be back with David. Stay with us.
Can we get strawberries?
Okay.
Welcome back to North County Voice. We're speaking with David Victor. David, we left our discussion about the decommissioning of the nuclear power plant with economic challenges that we're facing. So let's continue that.
Yeah, so this is a big deconstruction project, an expensive one, has major implications for jobs in the local community, and it also has some pretty significant implications for ratepayers because a large trust fund has been built up. The panel that I chaired does not oversee that trust fund at all. There are other groups that are doing that, but a large trust fund has been built up to pay for the decommissioning process, and the money that's left over in that fund when it's done will be given back to ratepayers. And so people are attentive to getting the right balance between doing this process with minimum cost, but also making sure that the process of decommissioning maximizes the local economic benefits because a lot of people have been hit pretty hard, especially in Oceanside.
Just on rough numbers, does it appear at this point that the trust fund is adequate to fund the decommissioning?
It does. So our panel has reviewed the cost estimates as well as some of the trust fund information, mostly for the purpose of helping the communities understand that the money is there and that the total expected cost of decommissioning is well within the size of the trust fund. We don't oversee that process in any detail, but it does appear that with a contingency, in fact, that there's plenty of money there.
I'm just going to take a guess at this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there probably isn't a good crossover between the people who used to, in terms of skill sets needed, the people who used to work there when it was an operating plant and the people who will be needed to decommission it.
Well, I think to me, what's interesting is that there's a lot of potential crossover. So first of all, security. Right now, the dominant employee function of the plant is security, and that will continue for the foreseeable future. So there's complete crossover there. The engineering skills and the specialized engineering skills, those are different kinds of skills, although some of the companies that are now specializing in decommissioning also had skills in building nuclear plants as well. But then I think a lot of the specialized labor, those skills do cross over, and I think there's actually a huge opportunity here for labor, organized or not, to participate in the process of decommissioning.
So is there an effort then to give opportunity as much as possible to people who were forced out due to the...
Those decisions ultimately are decisions that Edison and its contractors are going to make, but our panel certainly and many other folks have made it very loud and clear that the community is worried about the ongoing economic impact of not having the plant operating, and they would like as many of those benefits and jobs to flow locally as possible.
You mentioned Oceanside significantly hit. Have you studied it to the point where you can name a percentage between San Diego County and Orange County? Is the majority of the impact San Diego County?
That seems right to me. I don't have those numbers at the top of my head, but that seems right to me.
And presumably Oceanside would be the biggest participant.
Yeah, I mean, Oceanside's the epicenter.
How close are we to coming up with some sort of budget on what the positive impact would be? I assume the spending is heavy in the first few years.
Yeah, so in fact, there's on the website, songscommunity.com, there's the data that we reviewed at our last meeting of the community engagement panel on the overall economic impact and then some of the economic impacts of the decommissioning process. And it'll be front-loaded. The next decade or so, a little less than a decade, will be the largest positive economic impacts from the decommissioning process, and then it'll tail off after that.
You brought up a good point, and we'll try to repeat this at the end of the show as well. Your results are posted on the website on a regular basis. So if people want to know more about this and/or stay updated, they should go to
songscommunity.com, and they can get video of every single one of our meetings. They can get readouts of the major questions and responses to those questions from those meetings, and then they can also get copies of all the documents shared at the meetings, as well as all the major correspondence amongst the members of the community engagement panel leading up to and after these meetings. We're trying to make this as transparent as possible without generating an unmanageable fire hose, and I hope we've got the right balance, and I look forward to people letting us know.
Are your meetings open to the public?
Yes. In fact, people should come to a meeting. Next meeting, for example, the one on June 22nd, will be about what to do with the spent fuel, which is an area where the policy and strategy is changing very rapidly in a positive way.
Just before we get to that, do you always meet at the same location?
No, we move it around. So typically one meeting out of 4 every year is done in North County, so in Oceanside, and then the rest of them usually happen in southern Orange County.
Okay, and is it quarterly? Did I hear
Quarterly,
you say
roughly quarterly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about spent fuel. What are the options?
2.5 years ago, I took on this volunteer job as being chairman of this panel, and I think, to me, the biggest surprise was the extent to which folks learned through this process that the spent fuel was going to be stuck on the site. Because the original game plan at every single reactor in the country was that fuel would be burned in the reactors, and then put in pools, cooled down, and then put into canisters and then shipped off site to a permanent storage location. That location was to be Yucca Mountain in Nevada. As the politics around Yucca Mountain have gotten nasty and impossible, the Yucca Mountain option seems almost dead in the water, although, that might change in the future. But even if it changes quickly, Yucca Mountain really won't be open for business until the 2020s or 2030 or maybe even later. And so at 60 sites around the country, the fuel's just backing up in these canisters, including San Onofre. And for decommissioned sites like San Onofre, this is a particularly big problem because it's the only thing that'll be left there, and the community understandably wants the fuel moved. Without Yucca, there was really no other option unless maybe some future technologies, there's technology called deep borehole technology, maybe those technologies would become possible, but those are research projects, and there really was nothing to do. Over the last 1.5 years or so, private companies have emerged working with local communities. There's one site in West Texas. There's one site in southeastern New Mexico. There might be other sites as well. There was a site quite a long time ago in Utah that would be what are called consolidated interim storage facilities, places where reactors such as San Onofre could send their fuel on an interim basis until a permanent facility opened up. Very quickly, the politics around making these consolidated facilities have become much more favorable. And for example, the site in West Texas has just recently filed for its operating license, which will take about 3 years or so. A similar process, a little bit delayed for the site in southeastern New Mexico. So this is now becoming a real possibility if we get political support for this. And this is something that the panel has spent a lot of time on. And the towns around the panel and other political bodies have been passing resolutions. Oceanside recently passed a resolution in favor of changes in federal law to make this possible. The stars are really starting to line up here, and I think it's a really encouraging development.
So off-site is a possibility.
Oh, I think it's not a done deal, but the odds of it happening have risen steadily over the last 1.5 years. It still requires a change in federal law because right now, the law right now is written in a way that as the fuel is sent from a reactor like San Onofre to a permanent storage facility, Yucca Mountain, that the responsibility for the fuel passes to the government, to the Department of Energy, and the liability passes to the government, and the cost of paying for all that is paid for by a trust fund of $30 billion or so that is accumulated in Washington but is not being spent right now. So all that was pretty clear. The concern that a lot of people have is that these interim facilities don't have such a clear legal establishment. So liability needs to be clarified, the mechanism by which it'll be transported needs to be clarified, the funding for all that needs to be clarified, and that probably requires a change in federal law. Otherwise, private companies are not going to come in and finally sign contracts to send this fuel there. And that I think is the big stumbling block right now. And that's where the situation in Washington has changed a lot. Congressman Issa, among many others, is co-sponsoring legislation in this area, and that's what we're trying to get changed.
Are the early stages of decommissioning the same no matter what? In other words, is the first canister they go in suitable either for on-site or off-site storage?
Yeah, so the canisters will stay the same. What happens is the fuel comes out of the reactor core and is put into pools, which is where most of the San Onofre fuel is right now. And then as it cools down, it's taken out of the pools, dried, and put into these canisters. The canisters then go into a concrete overpack, so basically a protective shell made out of concrete, either sitting horizontally or sitting vertically, and that's designed to be there for the foreseeable future. If it's then moved to some other place, then the canister is taken out of the concrete overpack, put into a special extra canister for transportation, and then sent to the location, the ultimate location. Right now, the Department of Energy has just let out the first contracts to do the test rail cars and other canisters, other equipment necessary to move these canisters over long distances. And so all the technological parts of that are now starting to come into focus.
Is any of the technology or process that's being used unique? Is it being used for the first time, or are these tried and true processes that have worked?
I would say that the elements are all tried and true, and the systems are unique to nuclear power because there's no other place other than the military, which also has sent tens of thousands of shipments now of spent fuel and other kinds of materials around the country. So the idea that we would move this kind of material around and use these kinds of technologies, that's not new. The particular systems and the way the systems are all structured are unique to commercial reactors. This is, I think, been one of the reasons why it's been important that the vendors that Edison uses for example, making the casks are the same vendors that other plants are using, so that we can learn from the experiences being gained inside the industry. And my readout is that Edison, that's exactly the strategy that Edison is following, which is a safety in numbers. Because the fuel is stuck on site and potentially for a long time, one of the things that will be very new here is the technologies need to be developed to monitor the casks now over a long period of time. So for example, little robots have been developed that crawl around the cask and take pictures and measurements and things like that. That process is now underway, and it's called in the industry an aging management program. And one of the things I've committed to the public is that as this comes into focus for San Onofre, that we're going to take all that technical literature and kind of translate it into English so that people understand what the Defense in Depth program looks like, so that they don't need to be concerned about the integrity of the spent fuel being stored on site.
David, we have about a minute. What do you think the most important thing is for local residents to know about this process?
I think they should know that serious, committed people are paying attention to all these details, and they should know that if they want to learn more or get engaged, that this panel was set up to help them. And I would encourage them to get as involved as they want to be.
Okay, let's name the website again.
It's songscommunity.com, and they'll get information there about the upcoming meetings and lots of other materials, and they can send us emails and suggestions, and this process is going to work if the community is fully engaged, and I think we have a mechanism in place to make that happen.
And the date of the next meeting?
June 22nd.
Location?
Southern Orange County. The details will be up on the website.
David, thanks. That was a lot of information, probably 99% of it unknown prior to this discussion, at least by me, and probably a lot of our viewers. So thanks for sharing it.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you.
You're welcome. And thank you for watching this edition of North County Voice. Now, this show and all other KOCT shows are available as video on demand at koct.org. Thanks for watching.
HBL Hair Care, healthy ingredients for healthy hair. Enhance health, reveal natural beauty, and give new life to your hair. Experience the holistic difference of HBL Hair Care.